Hello, good afternoon. My name's David Hope-Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the third in our series of Malawi-Scotland governance webinars. I'm going to pass over in a moment to our chair for the event, Professor Asiyati Chiweza, and she's going to navigate us through the next hour or so. But I just wanted to start by saying thanks ever so much for being involved. I think citizen trust is a hugely important issue in Malawi, as it is in Scotland and the UK, and perhaps recent events have really borne out the importance and relevance of what we're going to talk about today. But really, today's all about listening to our friends in Malawi. So without any further ado, let me hand over to the chair for this afternoon, Professor Chiweza. I'll maybe come in just at the very end to talk you through our next event in this series. But Professor Chiweza, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that warm welcome, and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined this webinar today. Thank you very much for coming. We actually started these seminars on the 27th of October, when we featured an introduction to the new book, Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi. The second webinar covered the first chapter by Dr. Henry Chingaipe, and today's webinar is the third in a series of webinars, each exploring a chapter in greater detail. So these webinars are being held under the auspices of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership that has had a long-held aspiration to facilitate meaningful dialogue in the area of governance strengthening. So between today and May 2022, the Scotland-Malawi Partnership will host a series of 5 seminars which relate to the remaining chapters in the book. Now, Beyond Impunity is an edited book that has 15 chapters which were written by 25 authors. And the book itself was inspired by the unique events of 2019 to 2022 in Malawi, where for the first time in the history of sub-Saharan Africa, a flawed presidential election was invalidated by 5 constitutional court judges, and where the opposition then won the rerun poll. We give credit to the authors who drafted their chapters at a very challenging time in mid-2020 when Malawi was facing the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. We are also very much indebted to the anonymous peer reviewers, both local and international, who freely gave of their time and expertise to ensure that the chapters reach the highest possible standard. It is important to recognize that the core of this series of webinars is a Malawian-led endeavor, and it is entirely non-governmental in nature. Scotland only became involved after the book had been almost entirely completed. So their role has been to offer modest financial support and to engage people in a meaningful two-way sharing. It has had no influence over either the content of this book or these webinars. Malawi's multi-party democracy and governance since 1994. It indeed accessible account, bringing together critical insight and a sense of hope. In this webinar today, we have Professor Happy Kayuni and Joseph Chunga, in Malawi, examining citizen trust in Malawi from 1999 to 2019. Let me briefly introduce these two speakers. Happy Kayuni is a professor in the University of Malawi's Political and Administrative Studies Department. He holds a PhD in political science from University of Western Cape. Currently, he's also the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science. Happy's professional expertise is in areas of political governance, public administration and management, gender and international development policy of the Associated Program at the Center for Development and Environment, University of Oslo, Norway. Let me turn to Joseph Chunga. He is a research fellow at the Center for Social Research, University of Malawi. He's also a PhD candidate in politics at the University of Cape Town and he holds a master's degree in political science and a bachelor's degree in public administration. His research spans a wide range of topics around democracy and governance, including elections, public opinion, political economy, and constitutionalism. Now, before I hand over to Joseph Chunga and Professor Happy Kayuni, let me cover some of the essential administrative points. As I am talking, please feel free to introduce yourself in a sentence, and don't be shy about sending a direct message to others to make useful connections. After the speakers, there will be some reflections from Professor Mattis, and then we will go into an open discussion, question and answers, and further reflections. Please put any questions and comments in the chat box. If you're active, you may also tweet through the discussion using @Scotland Malawi or @Malawi-Scotland. Now, I would like you to know that the webinar is being recorded as a video and will go up online soon together with a record of the chat log and any copies of presentations that we may receive. Now, let me hand over to you, Joseph Chunga and Professor Kayuni. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chiweza, and thank you very much to everybody who's joined us. So in the next few minutes, we'll be sharing our reflections. That's me and the Professor Kayuni on what we call 2 decades of governance in Malawi, focusing on the citizens' trust. I'm here to just talk briefly about our motivation for this. We thought we can talk about governance in this dispensation without really looking at this relationship of the state institutions and citizens, especially because our constitution specifically states that, you know, all authority in Malawi and those who hold different positions of authority do derive their mandate from the people, and their exercise of such authority is supposed to be founded, and not only founded, but also sustained on sustained trust of the people. That's why we thought this should be one of the critical issues I would need to look at when talking about governance in Malawi at the moment. So without much ado, let me hand over to Prof. Kayuni, who is going to share our reflections, would say. Thank you so much. Over to you, Prof. Kayuni.
Thank you so much, Dave, Joseph. And I should mention that you will not be able to see my face. I'm not so sure about the internet connection, how strong it is. So I have skipped that one. So if you wanted to see my face, probably at the end, after we have done our job. Okay, just as Joseph highlighted, we are going to talk about 2 decades of governance in Malawi, and specifically looking at the citizen trust in Malawi from 1999 to 2019. I want to do something here. I'm being blocked on my screen. I can't see my own screen. Not necessarily there's just some technical hitch that I am facing here. Anyway, this is the outline of our presentation. There are some words which I can't see because I'll need to find out how. Okay, it has been sorted now. So this is the outline of our presentation. We introduce, then also provide the concept, a discussion on the concept of governance, public trust, a brief background to governance in Malawi, then the general trends, which are the findings of our research, and finally we'll be concluding. Specifically, the aim of this paper is to critically examine trajectories of public trust in key governance institutions. And in this case, we are talking about parliament, the courts, and the presidency, as well as the police. And in this case, we are exploring factors that affect public trust and implications on state legitimacy and prospects for democracy. Now, why are we looking at these institutions? So the idea is mainly looking at the three arms of government. In this case, as you are aware, we are talking about the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. However, the police has been added as well, included in this paper, because it was an epitome of state force under one-party rule. So that's why we included the police as something very, I can say, an interesting institution to examine the way it performed during the one-party rule, and also how it has been performing in the post-1994 era. So it's an interesting institution. So we felt that we must include that one. So that's why it is also featuring among the three arms of government, and obviously the police are falling under, in this case, under the executive. But just for this paper, we have isolated that. Increasingly, contemporary political governance studies are acknowledging the role of citizens in good governance. In other words, you cannot necessarily talk about good governance, as I'm going to explain shortly, minus citizen trust. Just as my colleague Joseph highlighted, that even when you look at our constitution, the constitution clearly says that it derives its legitimacy from the trust of the citizenry. Therefore, it is very clear that good governance and political trust are very critical. And so in this case, what we are saying is that it has long-term legitimacy and the democratic consolidation of any polity. Now, we are using mainly Afrobarometer, and that is the several Afrobarometer data sets, and as well as the other reviews. What we are saying in our paper is that there is a general decline in public trust of key governance institutions, that this decline is related to government performance and integrity. So it's about mainly government performance and integrity. Those are some of the key factors that are affecting this decline in public trust. And this has an effect on political legitimacy. And the key areas that we are looking at are perception of government handling of food challenges, perceptions of government management of the economy, just general performance, and the levels of corruption. Now, briefly, we just want to explain what do we mean by political trust and the governance in our paper. So political trust is defined as the ratio of people's evaluation of government performance relative to their normative expectations of how government ought to perform. This is in the definition according to Hetherington and Hauser in 2019, 2012. Specifically, there is that expectation on one hand on how government should perform, and on the other is the percentage of the citizenry of on how they evaluate that expectation. So there are those two issues that lead towards this definition of what we mean by public political trust. So according to Miller and Listhurst, they also say that when we are talking about this political trust, it's akin to judgment of the citizenry on the political system and its leadership. Yes, we have in a democratic polity, periodically we have elections, etc. Yes, that can be one of the manifestation of political trust, whether evaluation of political trust. But even without elections, what is it that people are saying, their perceptions, their views? That is also a judgment on its own, on the polity itself, as well as its leadership. So empirical studies have shown that low levels of political trust are associated with a less low compliance within a society. For example, according to Hetherington, it produces a political environment in which political leaders find it difficult to successfully lead or implement policies or even win an election. So when there is no trust, it's very difficult for government to push through any type of policy. We know, those of us who have been in Malawi, what happened towards the end of Peter Mutharika's government, that there were issues of proposed lockdowns, etc. Many policies, people were just opposing, because it was at a time when the political trust, the general environment out there was significantly against the government. So whatever was being said, it was misinterpreted, misunderstood. So it is very difficult to push anything when there is and not only that, but even the law compliance becomes a challenge. And so political trust is the core too, and has direct implications on good governance. Ramesh also reinforces the same argument that we are highlighting here. So governance, the definition of governance that we are using is from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation 2019, which says the provision of the political, social, and economic public goods and services that every citizen has the right to expect from their state, and that a state has the responsibility to deliver to its citizens. So that's the way, there are several definitions of governance, but we are taking it from that perspective. We don't want to go too much into the theoretical gymnastics of looking at what do we mean by good governance, and what is the difference with the governance types and so on, challenges of which definition, our conceptual understanding. But briefly, we can just say that the concept of good was later added to governance, mainly to express a desired value of governance. So when just some people feel, scholars felt that when you just talk about governance, there's something missing, but we need to add the prefix good just to express that desired value. But as I said, we don't want to go too much into that gymnastics. But some of the indicators that we are using in our analysis, or we are assuming in our analysis, mainly from the World Bank, UNDP indicators, which talk about political accountability, freedom of association, participation, rule of law, etc. Briefly, we need to talk a little bit about governance in Malawi. In our paper, we have quite a good section that discusses this, but briefly we can say that from independence to, that is in 1964 to 1994, Malawi's governance system revolved around an individual, Kamuzu Banda. There was this slogan, Zonse Zimene za Kamuzu Banda. Everything in Malawi belongs to Kamuzu Banda. I think it was coined by, it is said, coined by Kanyama Chiume, arguably coined by Kanyama Chiume. But anyway, so the presidency dominated parliament and any other policy-making governance institution in the country. Parliament was mainly just to rubber stamp what the executive has already highlighted. So that was the scenario. But the reintroduction of multi-party system of government in 1994 provided an opportunity for a renewed democratic political system. In other words, there was a proper legal and political platform established to ensure meaningful participation of citizens in development agenda of the country. Now, let me quickly go to the trend in terms of trust from in these offices, specifically the presidency, the legislature, the police, and the courts, from 1999 up to, so these are the general trends. What you see in the blue color, that is the president, the office of the president. Maroon is in MP, member of parliament. Gray color that's the police. While yellow is the courts. So this is, as we already said, several rounds of Afrobarometer studies that we are conducted in Malawi. So from 1999, so the general picture here, in aggregate terms, we can say that with minor exceptions, the trend shows that there's been a general decline in the level of trust. This is based on the responses from respondents who said it has gone down a lot or somewhat. I mean, their trust on government was a lot or somewhat. So we see that for all institutions, there's that general decline. However, we can see some exceptions. We can see some kind of dynamics that are unique, etc. But we can see that from 1999 up to around 2005, in general, there was increased approval or trust for most of the institutions. But from 2008, we see a major significant reduction in trust for almost all institutions. For example, in 2008, we see that even in the courts, the judiciary or courts specifically, the trust has always been high as compared to the other three. It has always been high, but in 2008, it was lower than that of the president. In fact, in 2008, the president had a significantly higher trust as compared to the rest. But in general, from that period going onwards, we see a major slump going down in terms of trust for all these institutions that we are interested in. But of course, there are a few exceptions, like in 2014, there was an improved trust in 2017, sorry, in the courts. And also in 2014, there was an improvement in terms of trust from 2014 to 2019 in the office of the president. Now, there are some. What are some of the possible explanatory factors? The first one is that we are highlighting is the levels of corruption. When the data of respondents who perceived the existence of corruption of specific institutions is compared to their perception of trust for the same institutions, it suggests there is a relationship. So the higher the perceived perception of corruption for a specific office, the lower is the trust for the same. So if you trace in the data, those who perceived a higher level of corruption, the same individuals also indicated lower trust for those key institutions. So we can see that relationship. So the paper agrees with the other studies which attributed higher levels of corruption to loss of citizenry trust. Another explanatory factor is government handling of food challenges, management of economy, and general performance. So when the data of 2003 to 2019 of respondents' perception of government handling of some of the most important problems facing the country, that is the food challenges and management of the economy, are analyzed in relationship to their perception of trust of the office of the presidency, it shows there is a positive relationship. So in other words, the higher the proportion of people felt that the government had handled well food challenges and management of the economy, the higher the proportion of those that trusted the office of the president and vice versa. So just like when we are talking about corruption, there was that positive relationship. For instance, between 2003 and 2008, there was an increase of 37% of respondents who felt that the government's handling of the economy was good. And in the same period, trust of the office of the presidency also increased by 31%. So there is that kind of relationship. If government is perceived to be performing well, and in our study, we are interested in food challenges, management of the economy, and general performance, we see that the trust also goes up, especially for the office of the presidency. Likewise, trust in the office of the presidency significantly declined by 50% between 2008 and 2012, while the perception of the government handling of food security and managing the economy also declined by 15 and 38% respectively over this same period. So we can see that the moment people feel that the government is not doing well in key areas such as management of the economy, food, handling of food challenges, etc., then it has an implication on trust as well. Now, what are the consequences? As we mentioned the earlier on, we wanted to go further and look at what are the consequences, implications on state legitimacy and the prospects for democracy. Because at the end of the day, we need to also look at that aspect. What we found from the data is that there is declining support of elections as a method of choosing political leaders. So data from 2003 to 2019 shows that there is a general rise in people who think we should choose leaders through other methods than elections, because elections produce bad results. We are not saying that the majority, if you check in the paper, we have the actual percentages, etc. We are not saying that people are saying the majority are saying they're abandoning democracy per se. That's not the fact here, but there's a general rise in people who think that we should find other alternatives for choosing leaders, because that has an implication on the area analysis on the issue of trust. Also, what we are seeing is a decline in support and satisfaction with democracy. So data from 1999 to 2019 shows that support for democracy, in other words, democracy always preferred to other forms of government, and satisfaction with how government democracy is working in Malawi are also on the decline. On obeying the law, you remember in the literature review, there was an issue about compliance to the law, etc., vis-a-vis political trust. What we are also seeing is that in relation to trust in the police and the legitimacy of the police to enforce people's obedience to the law, the proportion of the respondents who believe the police have the right to ensure that people always obey laws significantly declined in 2017. And this also matched with the loss of trust in the same year. Respondents who mentioned that people hold police legitimacy to enforce laws when matched with their level of trust in the police, the result shows a decline from 84% in 2014 to 51% in 2017. And the trust in the police declined from 60% in 2014 to 53% in 2017. So we can see that that has an implication, which confirms what some studies have said about the law compliance and like that. Now, what is it that we are concluding from our paper? Our conclusion is that the Afrobarometer survey results show that from 1999 to 2009, Malawi has faced a significant decline in trust of key governance institutions. This is especially the case from 2008, following a general positive trend from 1999 to 2008. And also, it could be possible that from 1999 to 2008, people were still giving a chance to our leaders, or the leaders were performing well, but probably their judgment was not as harsh, because they were still giving chance to the political establishment. But probably after 2008, they said, wait a minute, we are not seeing what we expected in terms of performance. Corruption, etc. And probably remember our definition of political trust, the expectation vis-a-vis what is happening on the ground based on their perception. Also, a growing number of people are losing trust in elections as a method of choosing leaders, and there is a general decline in support and satisfaction with democracy. Thus, some key explanatory factors or issues that need to be seriously considered if trust has to be restored include improving the anti-corruption drive, need for government to effectively handle food challenges, management of the economy. As you are aware, there's already a lot of discussion as we are speaking this year, last year, about AIP, Affordable Input Program, whereby it's a subsidy program, farm input subsidy program. And the way it was handled last year, people complained a lot. And this year, there's a lot of also talk around that. So it's a clear indication that if that area can be handled very well, it may affect trust. Because there's some papers that have been written on the politics of food in Malawi, maize in particular. There's a lot of politics associated with that. But anyway, in the interest of time, I may not necessarily dwell too much on that, but it's an area that can be a critical factor in explaining a lot of things in the Malawian context. And also government to effectively handle general public performance. So issues of general performance are critical in building people's trust. Okay, thanks so much for listening. Over to you, Chair. Or maybe my colleague may have something to say before I hand over. Joseph, maybe you have one or two things to add? Thank you.
Now let me hand over straight back to the chair in the interest of time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Happy and Joseph, for this excellent presentation. The data is based on 1992 to 1999 to 2019 period, but the issues which they are raising, they are very important even for the present time. There are three key things that they have raised. The issue of trust as it is related to handling of corruption, the general economy, as well as food challenges. Now, I would like to indicate that for each webinar, we have a respondent who is carefully selected in line with the topic. And we are delighted this month to have Professor Robert Mattis, who will actually share his reflections on the presentation. I would now like to turn to Professor Robert Mattis. Let me briefly introduce the professor. He is a professor of government and public policy at the University of Strathclyde and honorary professor at the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa at the University of Cape Town. Professor Mattis holds a PhD in political science from the University of Illinois. He is also a co-founder and senior advisor to Afrobarometer. Now, this is very important because the data that has been analyzed by the two presenters is Afrobarometer data. Professor Mattis has also helped to launch and run other major research projects, such as the African Legislators Project and the South African National Election Study. So it is a great pleasure to have you as our respondent this afternoon. Professor Mattis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to, hopefully I have to take the full 10 minutes to make a few comments about the broader context of the excellent presentation we just saw. I think it was an extremely thorough, wide-ranging presentation telling us about the important trends in trust in Malawi, about the key predictors of trust, and also about some of the key consequences. So I really have nothing to add to that, or to correct that, or to critique that. What I'd like to do is add that by adding in, talking about the broader context, the broader African context, and possibly suggesting a few, and what that tells us about a few possible new wrinkles that might be brought into the further understanding of conditions and dynamics in Malawi. First of all, and I've just been looking at some of the data on this for something else I've been working on, but if you take the same 30 countries that Afrobarometer has worked in now for 4 consecutive rounds of surveys, basically over the last 15 years, we find a very, so Malawi's not unique. There's been a very sharp, steady decline in trust across these 30 countries. Generally on the order that the average country trust in the presidency has dropped by about 12 points, in parliament by about 12 points, in local councils and in the governing party about 8 or 9 points. But it's been consistent trend. Obviously, you've seen sharper dynamics in Malawi. So again, just to compare it to the generalized slide in trust. What's also really interesting, if you look at the data, and this may be something else you might want to think about in the Malawi conversation, is the scale that Afrobarometer uses to measure trust is offers respond as 4 categories. For each institution we ask about, you can say you have a great deal of trust in them, you trust them somewhat, you distrust them somewhat, I believe, and then lastly, you have no trust in them at all. And generally, we, as well as this paper has done, the standard way we have done that is to separate the top 2 responses and call that trust, and the bottom 2 responses and call that distrust. And there's nothing wrong with that. Another way of thinking about it is to actually combine the middle 2 categories into a kind of a skepticism. I mean, the argument is that many political thinkers over time have argued that citizens ought not to have high levels of blind trust in government. They should be more skeptical. And therefore, trusting somewhat or distrusting somewhat is the rational position of the good citizen. Just 10 years ago, 12 years ago, Africans were quite unique compared to, say, Latin Americans in other developing regions, that they were much more likely to express the highest levels of trust, what you might call blind trust. In contrast, Latin Americans were very likely, the largest number expressed not just distrust, but the lowest level, or what we might call cynicism, saying, I have no trust at all in these institutions. And so what we've seen now in Africa over the last 12 years is not just a general slide in trust, from trust to mistrust, but also a sharp uptick of the most cynical view of saying, I have absolutely no trust in these institutions. So that is worrying. I think also what the analysis tells us, and what's really important is the authors have told us and showed us and demonstrated that this is a performance-based evaluation. And we might say, well, what else did we expect? So what? It's important to note that just within the last 20 years, major political scientists who studied Africa assumed that Africans, especially in societies marked by large rural populations and with low levels of education, would simply express high levels of trust in their leaders simply because presidents and legislators and judges were seen as current day equivalents of traditional patrimonial leadership. Other political scientists, again, just within the last 10 or 15 years said, well, actually, we might expect levels of trust to change, but it's just based on what they call the politics of the belly, meaning as long as government, any government, whether it's corrupt or not, or democratic or not, doesn't matter, as long as they see to my day-to-day needs, beginning with food, but also income and employment, as long as that's taken care of, I will trust any government. And what this analysis shows is it falsifies those things, and it's important to draw that distinction. That Malawians are very discerning. They're willing to change their levels of trust in government depending on how well or badly they're governed. And it's not just on material conditions. They look at things like corruption when they make up, and other issues of governance when they make up their minds. At the same time, what the paper shows us that there's been some really interesting changes in the last, say, 2 to 3 years of contrasting trends, right? Of increasing, and from looking, if one looks at Malawi from abroad, one comes to the conclusion that Malawi had a flawed election but did the right thing. The court ordered a revote. There was a rotation in power. Both those things normally should be seen as good for democracy. And indeed, we see sharp upticks in trust in the courts and trust in the presidency. So those are really encouraging trends, but also very sharp further decreases in members of parliament and the police. And we don't know about the other institutions. It'd be really interesting to say which, the Electoral Commission, for example, and other institutions, what kind of trends did they have? And the reason I ask this is because of something else that the larger Afrobarometer data tell us for these 30 countries, which I've just been looking at, is that while there's been a generalized slide in trust, a decline in trust of about 10 points, what we've seen just in the last 10 to 5 years is something that the authors don't look at, that what they might consider wanting to consider in future analyses, is the role of news media. So that the levels of portions of Africans who say they get their news frequently through television, through radio, usually state-controlled sources, has remained constant. The level of newspaper, people who say they use newspapers is low and has remained fairly low, only about 20%, which is unfortunate because that is a source that's often in private hands, not in state hands. But what we've seen is a tripling of the percentage of people who said they get their news through the internet in the last 10 years, and the last 5 years, a doubling of the number of people who say they get news through social media. On its face, this may be good because generally these are news sources that are not in state hands. On the bad side, though, these are often sources of news, of information and disinformation, which absolutely have no filters. Compared to standard, they don't operate on kind of standard news, often according to standard news rules about the number of sources, about the amount of verification. There's a very thin editorial process about allowing a story to go public before you've actually verified it and checked it. And so I would, it's really, I think we have a lot of evidence that the slide in trust in Malawi is performance-based, but also you might ask to what extent the very recent rise of social media across the continent have done. Our analysis again shows that the decline in trust kind of tracks the increase in social media. And also I've done some basic correlational work in the most recent data across Africa. And there's a very sharp correlation between those who use social media and those who distrust political offices, and especially those who offer the most cynical views of political institutions. In contrast, those who use traditional forms of media, generally there's no impact, or maybe that actually makes them look a little more trusting. So just to ask the question then, to what extent social media as a more unconstrained a source of information, disinformation especially about the last election, would have been presumably a cauldron of rumors, information, disinformation about voting, about the courts, about the presidency, about the role of different political parties, about the partisanly inspired social media sources. So I think this would merit, I think the authors have done a really great job of showing the performance base, and I think there's a lot of room now for us in doing analysis in Africa to start really taking more seriously the role of traditional versus new types of media, and to what extent that is fueling a lot of discontent in democratic politics. And with that, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martins, for those reflections. And would now like to turn to the chat box. So we have about 15 minutes of open discussion and as well as some questions. Now, if we turn to the chat box, I see that there are a number of questions as well as comments. There's this one, someone is saying to Professor Kayuni and Chunga, what exactly were the people's expectations from the legislature? Would you agree with me that Malawians over-expect or expect too much from their parliamentarians, which would affect the so-called levels of trust? Do Malawians really know the roles of MPs? There's another question to you again. Have the results from this paper been presented to the institutions being assessed? And if yes, have they proposed actions to address the issue? Have the people surveyed suggested solutions? Are the increases and decreases in trust linked to specific events? And there's also another one to Professor Martins. How do you see citizen trust in your current location?
Okay, thank you, Prof.
In Scotland, how does it compare? particular. To Professor Kayuni and Chunga. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. I will just briefly talk about the second question, which is talking about whether we have presented these results to the said institutions. In general, as part of Afrobarometer protocol in terms of dissemination of the results, it is standard practice that after every round of the survey results, they are presented to selected members of those three arms of government. And sometimes those meetings don't take place because those who are supposed to get the results, to be presented the results, maybe they don't turn up. But apart from that, we use other outlets, the media, etc. So there are several ways in which the results, not everything in the Afrobarometer, the analysis part is presented. As you know, there are too many questions and results. But I can say that I was part of the team that also was involved in engaging with MPs, not the 2019 round of results of 2019, but I think if I'm not mistaken, it was the 2015 or so. I can't remember the exact year, but we have had engagement with the key institutions like the legislature. We met the chairpersons of several committees of parliament, and we had a discussion with them. We provided the results, what people are saying about their institution, and we also added the other results as well. And several other players and the media captured what we discussed and so on. So there are several outlets and for sharing the results, apart from directly engaging with those institutions. Yes, they also suggested some what can be done to improve their, for example, in this case, I'm talking about parliament. They did suggest ways of how they can improve their image, etc. So that was indeed done. Now, concerning, okay, maybe Joseph should come in before I continue with the other part.
Okay, Joseph.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat the same issues Prof. Kayuni said, only to, I think, address specific questions, whether people expected too much from MPs and whether people know exactly what the MPs should be doing and what were these expectations. I think when we're presenting these results to parliamentarians, I think in round 7, this issue of people having wrong expectations, I think it came out in our discussion with the parliamentarians. But I think my reflection, and perhaps others would consider that, is how are those expectations set? If members of parliament, during their campaign, they not only promise, but they deliver certain services that then they turn back and think people are expecting too much from them. I don't think it's a fair judgment on the people to say their expectations are wrong. Because if you're able to finance their funerals, you attend church services and so on and so forth, and you commit, including promising to sustain that line of patronage actually, in my view, instead of reflecting badly on the people who expect, we should be talking about who is setting this expectation. And I think as long as that expectation is set, I think I find it legitimate. A quick one on whether we can distinguish between trusting the rural versus urban areas. We haven't shown here, but that's something in Afrobarometer data and it can easily be, analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Mattis. How do you see citizen trust in your current location in Scotland? And how does it compare with Africa and Malawi in particular?
Well, yeah, I really can't answer for that. I don't look at or have access to data about British attitudes about trust.
Okay.
several of my colleagues do, but that's not something I can actually comment on in terms of that comparison. So I think the title was slightly a misnomer on the agenda about a Scottish. Yeah.
Okay. All right. There are many other questions in the chat box. Let me just pick one, but as presenters, please feel free to also respond through the chat box. There's one here. How critical is the role of civil society in sustaining trust, considering that CSO activism has equally been on the rise in the period 1999 to 2019? Joseph and Professor Kayuni.
Thank you, Chair. I think this one I'll ask Joseph to respond. He likes activism. So
I guess I'm not here as an activist.
yeah.
Yeah, but just want to say, you know, theoretically, there are those who argue that, you know, when you see people participating in what others have labeled as unconventional means or modes of participation, is a signal of issues of trust against the institution. So sometimes maybe you would say this is organized way of people presenting their demands on the system. And so when you see those protests, for example, for me, or when I see mob justice, what I look at is why are people resorting to this way of communicating what they were supposed to communicate otherwise? Why did these people take this suspected criminal to police? Why did they decide to do mob justice? It's not to justify, but to emphasize that that could be a pointer that something is not entirely right with the systems that expect to address those issues. So that's how I would look at it. On the other hand, maybe taking it from what Prof. Matters was saying, when you have people go out and protest, that's not in itself entirely a bad sign, because people have to be somehow skeptical of what the government is doing and where need be take to account even through those means other than the formalities that otherwise their representatives would have done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add, Professor Kayuni?
No, I think he has been spot on. Thank you.
Yeah,
Chair.
thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kayuni, Joseph Chunga, and Professor Mattis. We do have, a lot of questions, but I think this can also be addressed and sent to the participants. I would like to thank you very much for your excellent insights and individual perspectives, which has given us much food for thought about citizen trust in government, its influencing factors, and also its consequences. And to the audience, I would like to thank you for your excellent and thought-provoking contributions to the discussion. I would also like to thank the teams at the Scotland partnership for their cooperation and mutual support in hosting these webinars, and especially David Hope Jones for his untiring diligence in ensuring this whole series is a success, both in Scotland. That the book is from the African Books on demand basis, but it will also be available from University of Cape Town in April 2021. Let me wish you all the very best as we approach the Christmas holiday season. Let me hand over to David Jones, who is the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. David.
Professor Chiweza, thank you. Very much indeed. Just a few very quick closing remarks, if I may. I'm keen to recognise that there was a question about political trust in the Scottish context, and I'm keen that no friends in Malawi feel that we've dodged a bullet at this time. And quite right that Professor Mattis said that his role was reflecting on the paper that was given today rather than the context in Scotland. But in the spirit of openness and reciprocity, I think it's only fair to say that the themes explored today have particular relevance and resonance in the UK at this time. I did hear on the BBC's Respected Today programme this morning specific numbers on this, that in the Second World War, to the question, to what extent do you think political leaders are working in the best interests of this country? Shortly after the Second World War, 1 in 4 people said that they did feel that political leaders were working in the best interests of the country. And I understand that the latest data suggests that in the UK, that is now 1 in 20 people agree with the statement. Do you think that political leaders are working in the best interests of the country in the UK? So I think with all humility and reciprocity, it's good to recognise that the UK is very much in a learning place, and some of the trends we've observed in Malawi, there are interesting comparisons at the UK and the Scottish side as well. Not a party political point, but I hope an important point to have aired in our 60 minutes. But really, what I want to do is just say a very big thank you to all of our speakers, to our excellent Chair Associate Professor Asiyati Chiweza, to Mr. Joseph Chunga, and to Professor Happy Kayuni for their excellent paper, to Professor Bob Mattis for responding to that paper, and as the Chair said, wonderful to have a co-founder of Afrobarometer speaking with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining. Professor Chiweza, while you were talking just then, I lost the connection for a bit. I don't know if the problem was mine or at your end, but apologies if I'm repeating anything that you said. But the book on which this series is working, Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi, to which Professor Chiweza is one of the co-editors, and I know Ken Ross is also on the call as another of the co-editors. I'm delighted to say that the first print-on-demand versions of that book, and these are, I must emphasize, the advanced copies to accompany this series, are now available in the UK online. I'll put in the chat box a link to where you can get those. These are print-on-demand, so as is always the way, relatively expensive. But you'll see if you follow that link that Africa Books Collective are now for £40 selling the first print-on-demand copies. And we're delighted that the early copies of that book are now available for the future webinars. But I must emphasize that the main print run that we're supporting is in Malawi at a much more affordable price point. And the Scotland-Malawi Partnership funding allows around half of all the printed copies to be made freely available throughout Malawi to all the key government institutions and learning institutions. So please, don't be put off by the initial price ticket, but we're pleased to be able to offer that now. Finally, just to say our fourth webinar in this series is happening in the new year on the 26th of January. Again, 1 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. Malawi time. That session is looking at impunity versus constitutional legality in Malawi, particularly the 2019-20 presidential election case. We have our main Malawian speaker, Dr. Garton Kamjedzera, with a Scottish response by Lord Jim Wallace. He is the moderator of the Church of Scotland, former Deputy First Minister, twice former Acting First Minister, and former Advocate General for Scotland. So a constitutional expert, if ever there was one. Now, if possible, if still possible, the moderator will have just the day before have got back from Malawi, but we recognise with COVID the way it is, we don't know if that visit will be able to go ahead. But either way, we're confident he will be speaking with us on the 26th of January. So please keep that free for that exciting next webinar. Colleagues, if you could put up the poll to appear here, and friends, please do take a moment to answer these two very quick questions in the poll. And I think that was everything I was to announce. But just once again, thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers, for everyone for taking part. We will put the recording of this up on the website along with that PowerPoint presentation, and we will encourage our speakers to continue to answer those questions in writing and to put those by email to you. So if it hasn't appeared already, please do put the poll up on the screen. And before you leave, wonderful if you could answer those two very quick questions. But that's everything from me. Thank you very much for your time. And Professor Chiweza, thank you again for sharing. Thank you very much.